Hello friends, and tonight we travel back more than 2,500 years, to a world of dusty roads, wandering sages, forest monasteries, and ancient kingdoms stretching across the fertile plains of northern India. As always, before we begin, find a comfortable position, relax your shoulders, and allow the noise of the modern world to slowly fade into the distance. Tonight's story is the story of a man whose life would transform the spiritual history of humanity. A man who was born a prince, surrounded by luxury and privilege, yet willingly abandoned wealth, power, and comfort in search of something that could not be found in any palace. His name was Siddhartha Gautama. The world would later know him simply as the Buddha. But before he became the Enlightened One, before millions followed his teachings, and before emperors built monuments in his honor, he was simply a child born into a small republic near the foothills of the Himalayas. Our story begins in a landscape very different from the modern nations we know today. The India of the 6th century BCE was not a single unified empire. Instead, it was a patchwork of kingdoms, tribal territories, republics, and city-states. Some regions were ruled by powerful kings. Others were governed by assemblies of nobles. Trade routes connected distant communities. Merchants traveled across rivers and forests carrying spices, textiles, precious stones, and stories from faraway lands. Agriculture formed the backbone of daily life. Farmers depended on seasonal rains. Oxen pulled wooden plows through fertile soil. Villages clustered around rivers and streams. Life followed rhythms that had remained largely unchanged for generations. Yet beneath the surface, profound changes were taking place. Ancient religious traditions were being questioned. New philosophical ideas were emerging. Wandering teachers debated the nature of existence. People increasingly asked difficult questions. Why do human beings suffer? What happens after death? Is there a path to lasting peace? These questions would shape the age into which Siddhartha Gautama was born. According to tradition, his birthplace was Lumbini, a peaceful garden located in what is now southern Nepal. Even centuries later, the memory of this location remains so important that Emperor Ashoka traveled there on pilgrimage in order a commemorative pillar to be erected. The pillar still stands today as one of the most important pieces of historical evidence connected with the Buddha's life. The child who would become Buddha belonged to the Sakya people. The Sakyas were not rulers of a vast empire. Their territory was relatively small. Yet they maintained a proud identity and governed themselves through a republican system unusual for the time. His father was Suddhodana, a respected leader of the Sakya clan. His mother was Queen Maya, often remembered for her grace and dignity. Tradition preserves many miraculous stories surrounding Siddhartha's birth. Ancient texts describe prophetic dreams, celestial signs, and predictions made by wise men. Whether one views these accounts as literal history or symbolic storytelling, they reveal something important. Even generations later, people believed that Siddhartha's birth had been extraordinary. Sadly, tradition also records that Queen Maya died only a short time after giving birth. As a result, Siddhartha was raised largely by his maternal aunt, Mahaprajapati Gautama. She cared for him as if he were her own son. Throughout history, countless children have been shaped by the love and guidance of those who stepped forward during difficult moments. Siddhartha was no exception. The young prince grew up surrounded by comfort and protection. Servants attended to his needs. Teachers instructed him in literature, politics, martial arts, and philosophy. The finest opportunities available to a noble child were placed before him. Yet historians often remind us that luxury can create its own kind of isolation. The palace walls protected Siddhartha from hardship, but they also shielded him from understanding how most people actually lived. Outside the palace gates, life could be harsh. Farmers worked long hours beneath the sun. Families struggled through droughts and floods. Disease appeared without warning. Old age gradually weakened even the strongest individuals. Death visited every household eventually. But according to traditional accounts, Siddhartha saw very little of these realities during his youth. His father hoped to protect him from unpleasant truths. Some stories suggest that Suddhodana feared an ancient prophecy. Wise men had predicted that Siddhartha would either become a great ruler or a great spiritual teacher. The king strongly preferred the first outcome. If suffering could be hidden from the prince, perhaps he would never develop an interest in religious life. Perhaps he would remain focused on power and leadership. Perhaps he would inherit responsibility for the Sakya people and continue their political traditions. For many years, this plan seemed successful. Siddhartha excelled in his education. He learned archery, horsemanship, and statecraft. He demonstrated intelligence and discipline. He gained admiration from those around him. Eventually he married a noblewoman named Yasodhara. Together they would later have a son named Rahula. From the outside, everything appeared ideal. A respected family. A promising future. Security, comfort, and social status. Many people might assume that such circumstances guarantee happiness. Yet human experience often tells a different story. Again and again throughout history, individuals who possessed wealth and privilege discovered that material success alone could not answer deeper questions. The same seems to have been true for Siddhartha. Even while living in luxury, he appears to have possessed a thoughtful and curious nature. He observed the world carefully. He reflected deeply. He wondered about the meaning of life. And slowly, questions began to emerge. Questions that would eventually change everything. At this point in the story, ancient sources become more symbolic than historical. They describe a series of encounters now known as the Four Sights. Whether these events occurred exactly as described is less important than the profound truth they convey. According to tradition, Siddhartha left the palace on a series of excursions. During one journey, he encountered an elderly man. The prince was struck by the man's appearance. His back was bent. His hair had turned white. His movements were slow and uncertain. Siddhartha asked what had happened to him. The answer was simple. He had grown old. More importantly, everyone who lived long enough would experience the same fate. For the first time, Siddhartha confronted the reality of aging. It was not an accident affecting a few unfortunate individuals. It was a universal condition. Every child would become an adult. Every adult would eventually become old. No amount of wealth could prevent the passage of time. The realization stayed with him. On another journey, he encountered a sick person. The man suffered visibly. Pain had weakened his body. Illness had disrupted his life. Again Siddhartha asked questions. Again the answers disturbed him. Disease could affect anyone. Rich or poor. Powerful or powerless. No one was completely immune. Then came the third sight. A funeral procession. A dead body. Mourners walking slowly. Faces filled with grief. Silence hanging heavily in the air. Death. the one certainty shared by all living creatures. Kings died. Warriors died. Farmers died. Children died. Entire civilizations eventually disappeared. No palace wall could keep death away forever. For Siddhartha, the encounter was deeply unsettling. If death awaited everyone, what meaning could be found in temporary achievements? What lasting security existed in a world where everything eventually changed? Then came the fourth sight. A wandering holy man. Unlike the others, he appeared calm, peaceful, untroubled. His clothing was simple. His possessions were few. Yet something about him seemed different. The monk had dedicated his life to understanding suffering and seeking wisdom. In him, Siddhartha glimpsed another possibility. Perhaps there was a path beyond fear. Perhaps there was a way to understand the human condition more deeply. Perhaps genuine peace could be found somewhere outside the pursuit of wealth and status. The four sights became a turning point. The world no longer appeared the same. Questions that once seemed distant now felt urgent. The comfortable life of the palace began to lose its appeal. The deeper mysteries of existence demanded attention. And as the years passed, Siddhartha found himself standing between two very different futures. One path led toward kingship. The other led toward an uncertain search for truth. Soon, he would make a decision that historians, philosophers, and spiritual seekers would remember for thousands of years. But that part of the story belongs to the next chapter. For now, as evening settles over the ancient plains of northern India, the young prince remains within the palace walls, contemplating questions that have challenged humanity since the beginning of history. Questions about suffering. Questions about happiness. Questions about what it truly means to live a meaningful life. And while he does not yet know it, the answers he seeks will eventually carry him far beyond the boundaries of his homeland and into the pages of world history. So for tonight, let the sounds of the ancient world fade gently into the distance. The palace lamps grow dim. The night air becomes cool. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the journey of Siddhartha Gautama is only just beginning. As the night deepens, let us return once again to the ancient plains of northern India. The palace of the Sakyas rests quietly beneath a sky filled with countless stars. Oil lamps flicker in distant hallways. Guards stand watch at the gates. Servants move silently through the sleeping residence. And somewhere within those palace walls sits a prince who can no longer ignore the questions that have taken root in his mind. For years, Siddhartha Gautama had lived surrounded by comfort. Yet comfort had not brought certainty. The sights he had witnessed, the old man, the sick man, the funeral procession, and the wandering monk, continued to echo in his thoughts. Perhaps you have experienced something similar. Sometimes a single realization changes the way we see everything around us. Once seen, it cannot be unseen. Once understood, it cannot be forgotten. For Siddhartha, the certainty of aging, sickness, and death had become impossible to ignore. Every celebration now seemed temporary. Every success appeared fragile. Every moment of happiness existed within a world where loss was unavoidable. Ancient texts describe him spending long periods reflecting upon these realities. He was not simply sad. Nor was he rejecting life itself. Instead, he was searching for something deeper. If suffering existed, could it be understood? If human beings experienced fear and loss, was there a way beyond them? These questions gradually became the center of his life. Meanwhile, his father remained concerned. King Suddhodana had devoted years to ensuring that his son would inherit leadership of the Sakya people. The possibility that Siddhartha might abandon royal life entirely was deeply troubling. The king continued arranging pleasures and distractions. Festivals filled the palace grounds. Musicians performed. Gardens were carefully maintained. Every effort was made to encourage Siddhartha to embrace his future as a ruler. Yet the prince's mind increasingly wandered elsewhere. The contrast between palace life and ordinary existence became impossible to ignore. Outside the walls, countless people faced hardship every day. Inside, luxury attempted to conceal those realities. The difference felt increasingly artificial. Then came a moment that tradition remembers as one of the most significant decisions in religious history. Siddhartha chose to leave. Not because he hated his family. Not because he despised wealth. Not because he sought adventure. He left because the search for truth had become more important than everything else. The event became known as the Great Renunciation. According to traditional accounts, it occurred when Siddhartha was 29 years old. His wife Yasodhara had recently given birth to their son Rahula. The arrival of a child would normally strengthen a person's attachment to family life. Yet for Siddhartha, it may have intensified his sense of responsibility. If suffering touched every human life, then finding a solution mattered not only for himself but for everyone. The night of his departure has been retold for centuries. Ancient storytellers describe the palace asleep beneath the darkness. Servants resting. Musicians silent. The halls unusually still. Siddhartha quietly prepared to leave. Before departing, tradition says he paused to look upon his sleeping wife and child one final time. He did not wake them. There were no dramatic speeches. No farewell ceremony. Only silence. Then, accompanied by his loyal charioteer Channa, he rode away from the palace. Beyond the city limits, Siddhartha stopped. There, he removed the symbols of his royal identity. Fine clothing was exchanged for simple garments. Jewelry and ornaments were set aside. His long hair was cut. The transformation was symbolic as well as practical. The prince was becoming a seeker. A man who possessed almost nothing. A traveler whose destination was unknown. For many modern people, such a decision seems almost unimaginable. Most individuals spend years trying to gain security, wealth, and comfort. Siddhartha voluntarily walked away from them. Yet throughout history, some of humanity's most influential figures have chosen similar paths. They believed that understanding reality required stepping outside ordinary expectations. The road ahead was uncertain. Northern India during this period was home to countless religious movements. Some teachers emphasized meditation. Others practiced strict self-discipline. Still others explored philosophical questions about existence and consciousness. Traveling teachers wandered from village to village. Students gathered beneath trees to listen. Debates took place in marketplaces and forests. Ideas competed for attention. The age was remarkably vibrant intellectually. Siddhartha entered this world as a student. Despite his noble birth, he approached many teachers seeking guidance. One of the first influential figures he encountered was Alara Kalama. Alara was respected for his mastery of meditation. His teachings focused on advanced states of concentration and awareness. Under Alara's guidance, Siddhartha learned quickly. In fact, traditional sources suggest that he progressed with unusual speed. The skills that took others years to master seemed to come naturally to him. Eventually, he achieved the same high meditative attainments as his teacher. Alara was impressed. Some accounts even suggest that he invited Siddhartha to become an equal partner in leading the community. For many students, this would have represented extraordinary success. Yet Siddhartha remained dissatisfied. The meditative states were profound. They brought tranquility and clarity. But they did not fully answer his questions. The peace they offered seemed temporary. Eventually, the experience ended. The deeper problem remained unresolved. And so Siddhartha continued his search. His next major teacher was Uddaka Ramapada. Like Alara, he was highly respected. His teachings explored even more refined levels of meditation. Again Siddhartha learned rapidly. Again he mastered the techniques. Again he reached the highest levels available within the tradition. And once again he encountered disappointment. The practices were impressive. The experiences were extraordinary. Yet they still did not provide the complete liberation he sought. Many people would have stopped searching at this point. After all, Siddhartha had already achieved what others considered remarkable spiritual accomplishments. But he continued. He was unwilling to settle for partial answers. This determination would become one of the defining characteristics of his life. The search eventually led him toward a group of ascetics. These individuals believed that freedom could be attained through extreme self-denial. The body, they argued, was a source of attachment. Pleasure created dependence. Comfort encouraged weakness. Therefore, the solution seemed obvious. Reject comfort completely. Deny every desire. Subject the body to severe hardship. Only then could true liberation be achieved. To modern observers, some of these practices seem astonishing. Ascetics might survive on tiny amounts of food. They exposed themselves to extreme temperatures. They endured long periods of physical discomfort. Some remained motionless for hours. Others practiced difficult forms of breath control. The goal was complete mastery over bodily desires. Siddhartha committed himself fully. If this path held the answer, he intended to discover it. For years he practiced austerities with extraordinary determination. His food intake became minimal. His body grew weaker. Ancient descriptions portray him as alarmingly thin. His ribs became visible. His muscles diminished. His strength faded. Yet despite all of this effort, enlightenment remained beyond reach. The more he suffered physically, the more one troubling realization emerged. Pain itself was not producing wisdom. Extreme deprivation was not revealing ultimate truth. The body became weaker. The mind became exhausted. But genuine liberation remained distant. This realization marked another crucial turning point. One day, after years of severe asceticism, Siddhartha recognized that he had exchanged one extreme for another. Royal luxury had been one extreme. Self-torture had become the opposite extreme. Neither seemed capable of delivering lasting freedom. The insight was simple. Yet its implications were profound. Perhaps truth existed somewhere between excess and deprivation. Perhaps wisdom required balance. Perhaps neither indulgence nor punishment represented the correct path. This understanding would later become known as the middle way. At the time, however, it was merely a growing intuition. A suspicion that something fundamental had been misunderstood. And soon, Siddhartha would act upon that realization. A decision that shocked his fellow ascetics. A decision that would ultimately lead him toward the Bodhi Tree. Toward enlightenment. Toward becoming the Buddha. But that moment belongs to the next chapter of our story. For now, the future Buddha remains a wandering seeker. Thin from years of hardship. Far from home. Unknown to the world. Yet closer than ever to the discovery that would change history forever. And as the winds move softly through the forests of ancient India, the search continues beneath the quiet stars. The prince who abandoned a kingdom has not yet found his answer. But he is approaching it with every step. As we continue our quiet journey through ancient India, the night grows still once again. The forests are calm. The rivers move slowly. The wind passes through the trees with a soft, steady rhythm, as if the entire world itself has slowed down to listen. And somewhere within this silence, Siddhartha Gautama stands at a turning point. Years of intense ascetic practice have left his body weak. His ribs are visible. His strength has faded. His once noble appearance has been replaced by the physical exhaustion of extreme self-denial. And yet, despite all this suffering, the answer he seeks remains out of reach. It is at this moment that a quiet realization begins to take shape within him. A realization that will change the direction of his entire life. For a long time, Siddhartha had believed that truth could be reached through discipline and hardship. If pleasure was a distraction, then surely eliminating pleasure would lead to clarity. If desire caused suffering, then removing desire through force might bring freedom. But now, after years of effort, something feels deeply wrong with this approach. The body is weak, but the mind is not clearer. Pain is present, but wisdom is not arriving. The search has not ended. It has only become more exhausting. And so, slowly, almost gently, a new understanding begins to emerge. Neither luxury nor extreme suffering seems to lead to liberation. Both are extremes. Both pull the mind away from balance. Both create dependence in different forms. This insight, still forming, will later be known as the middle way. But Siddhartha does not yet have the language for it. He only senses that something fundamental must change. Around this time, traditional accounts describe a simple but important moment. Siddhartha is near the banks of a river, weakened and exhausted. His body can barely continue. The ascetics who had once admired him now begin to lose confidence in his ability to continue their strict practices. They see his weakness and assume he has abandoned discipline. And in a sense, he has. Not because he has given up, but because he has begun to see beyond it. Then comes an encounter that appears small in scale, but enormous in meaning. A village woman named Sujata approaches him. She sees a man who is clearly suffering. Not a king. Not a teacher. Not a philosopher. Just a human being on the edge of physical collapse. Moved by compassion, she offers him a simple meal. Milk rice. Ordinary food. Nothing sacred or elaborate. Just nourishment. For the first time in a long while, Siddhartha accepts food that is neither excessive nor absent. He eats. Slowly. Carefully. And something begins to change. It is not sudden enlightenment. It is not a dramatic transformation. It is simply the return of strength. The body, long neglected, begins to recover. His mind, no longer clouded by extreme deprivation, becomes steadier. The middle way is no longer just an idea. It is becoming a lived experience. Soon after, Siddhartha makes another decision that surprises those around him. He leaves the group of ascetics. They are disappointed. Some may even feel betrayed. After years of shared hardship, his departure feels like abandonment. But Siddhartha does not argue. He does not try to convince them. He simply walks away. Because now he understands something they do not yet see. Liberation is not found in extremes. Not in indulgence. Not in suffering. But in a more balanced understanding of life itself. With renewed strength, Siddhartha travels toward a place that will become one of the most important locations in human spiritual history. A quiet area near the town of Bodhi Tree. There, beneath a large fig tree, he finds a place to sit. The tree would later be known as the Bodhi Tree. But at this moment, it is simply a natural shelter. A place of rest. A place of silence. Siddhartha makes a simple vow. He will not rise until he has understood the nature of suffering. Until he has found the truth he has been searching for across years of struggle. The world around him does not change. But his intention becomes completely clear. He sits. Still. Unmoving. As daylight fades, night begins to fall. The stars appear above him. The forest becomes quiet. And Siddhartha enters deep meditation. Traditional accounts describe this night as one of intense inner experience. The mind becomes focused. Memories arise. Thoughts come and go. Questions surface. Doubts appear. And then, according to Buddhist tradition, a symbolic figure known as Mara appears. Mara is often understood not as a physical being, but as a representation of fear, desire, and distraction. Everything that pulls the mind away from clarity. Mara attempts to disturb Siddhartha's concentration. He represents doubt. He represents fear. He represents attachment to the world of suffering. But Siddhartha does not respond with fear. He does not flee. He does not resist violently. He simply remains present. Steady. Aware. Unshaken. The night continues. Meditation deepens. Thoughts arise and dissolve like waves on water. Time seems to lose meaning. The distinction between self and world begins to blur. And slowly, as dawn approaches, something shifts. Not in the external world, but within perception itself. Clarity arises. Understanding becomes complete. According to tradition, Siddhartha awakens to the true nature of existence. He sees suffering. He sees its causes. He sees its end. And he sees the path leading beyond it. This moment is known as enlightenment. From this point forward, Siddhartha Gautama is referred to as the Buddha, the awakened one. The silence of the night gives way to the quiet light of morning. The world remains the same. But everything is understood differently. The Bodhi tree stands still in the early sunlight. The forest breathes gently. And a human being, once a prince, now sees reality with complete clarity. But even after this profound realization, the story does not end. Because understanding something deeply is one thing. Sharing it is another. And soon, the Buddha will face a new question. Should this insight be taught to others? Would anyone understand it? Could such a subtle truth be communicated in a world full of confusion and desire? These questions will lead him to his first decision as the enlightened one. A decision that will set the wheel of teaching in motion. But that, as always, belongs to the next part of our story. For now, the forest remains quiet. The night has passed, and a new chapter in human thought has quietly begun beneath the Bodhi tree. The early morning light slowly spreads across the land near Bodh Gaya. The night that held Siddhartha Gautama's deepest meditation has passed. The forest is quiet now, as if it too is resting after witnessing something beyond ordinary understanding. And yet, for the one who has awakened beneath the Bodhi tree, the world is no longer the same. He is the Buddha, the awakened one. But what comes after awakening is not immediately clear. There is no instruction for what to do next. No guide for how to live after seeing reality as it truly is. According to tradition, a moment of hesitation follows. A long stillness. The Buddha remains seated in the quiet aftermath of enlightenment, observing the world around him. Everything appears ordinary. Trees, rivers, animals, distant human life continuing its endless patterns of birth and loss. And yet, from his perspective, something fundamental has been understood. The nature of suffering, the cause of suffering, and the possibility of its end. But here arises a difficult question. If such a realization is so subtle, so refined, so difficult to grasp, then can it even be shared? Would anyone understand? Or would the truth simply be lost in misunderstanding? Traditional accounts describe this as a moment of deep reflection. Not pride. Not doubt in the truth itself. But doubt in communication. The Buddha considers the world of ordinary perception. People are busy, attached, distracted, carrying desires, fears, habits, and deeply rooted assumptions. To explain something so delicate might be like trying to describe silence through sound, or trying to explain light to someone who has never opened their eyes. And so, for a moment, he considers remaining silent, living out the rest of his life in peaceful isolation. Not teaching, not traveling, simply existing in the clarity he has discovered. But according to Buddhist tradition, this is not the end of the story. In the vast cosmology of ancient texts, a divine being known as Brahma Sahampati appears. Whether understood literally or symbolically, this figure represents a turning point in the narrative. Brahma pleads with the Buddha. He asks him to teach, to share the insight, to open the path for those who are still lost in confusion. He argues that there are beings with only a little dust in their eyes. Those who may understand. Those who may awaken if given guidance. This moment is important not because of supernatural detail, but because of what it represents. The idea that insight, once discovered, carries responsibility. Not just personal liberation, but the possibility of helping others. After this encounter, the Buddha reflects again. The world is still difficult, but perhaps not entirely closed. Perhaps there are minds ready to listen. Perhaps there are hearts ready to understand. Gradually, compassion becomes the guiding force. Not obligation. Not duty. But a natural response to understanding suffering. If suffering can end, then perhaps it should be taught. Slowly, the decision forms. The Buddha will teach. And so begins a journey that will last for decades. He leaves the place of enlightenment and begins to travel. At first, he considers who might be ready to receive such teachings. His former teachers, Alara Kalama and Uddaka Ramapada, come to mind. But he learns that they have already passed away. So instead, he turns toward a group of 5 ascetics. These were the companions who once practiced extreme austerities with him. They had shared years of discipline and hardship, and they had witnessed his departure when he chose the middle way. Now, they reside at a place called Sarnath, near a deer park. When they first see him approaching, they are uncertain. They remember him as someone who abandoned strict ascetic practice. Someone who, in their eyes, may have given up the path. At first, they decide not to show respect. But something about him is different. There is a calmness that was not present before. A steadiness that does not depend on hardship or luxury. Gradually, despite their hesitation, they listen. The Buddha begins to speak. Not with force, not with authority, but with clarity. This moment becomes known as the first turning of the wheel of Dharma, a symbolic way of describing the beginning of teaching. The Buddha introduces a path that avoids extremes. Neither indulgence in pleasure nor self-inflicted suffering. A balanced way. A middle path. He explains the Four Noble Truths. A simple structure, but profound in meaning. First, that suffering exists. Not as punishment, not as accident, but as part of human experience. Second, that suffering has a cause. Rooted in desire, attachment, and misunderstanding. Third, that suffering can end. Not temporarily, but completely. And fourth, that there is a path leading to that end. A way of living, understanding, and practicing that leads toward liberation. As he speaks, something shifts among the five ascetics. At first, they are skeptical, then attentive, then deeply engaged. The ideas are not presented as abstract philosophy, but as lived understanding. Gradually, their resistance softens. Their assumptions begin to loosen. And one by one, understanding begins to arise. This is not described as sudden conversion, but as gradual clarity. Like a mist slowly lifting from a landscape at dawn. By the end of this teaching, something remarkable happens. The first group of followers is formed. The Sangha begins. Not as an institution, but as a community of those trying to understand and practice the path. The Buddha has begun to teach. The silence after enlightenment has ended. And now, words begin to flow again into the world. But these are not ordinary words. They are reflections of insight. Carefully spoken. Deliberately simple. Designed not to impress, but to awaken understanding. As evening approaches in the deer park at Sarnath, the first chapter of teaching quietly concludes. The five ascetics are no longer just listeners. They have become students. Perhaps even companions on the path. And the Buddha, once a wandering seeker alone beneath the Bodhi Tree, now stands at the beginning of a long journey across ancient India. A journey of teaching. A journey of dialogue. A journey that will continue for decades. But for now, the night returns once again. The deer park grows still. The wind moves gently through the trees. And a small community sits quietly together, beginning to explore a path that promises an end to suffering itself. The wheel has begun to turn. And it will not easily stop. As the night continues in our slow journey through ancient India, the story now shifts from a single moment of awakening to something much larger. A movement. A community. A quiet expansion of ideas across rivers, kingdoms, forests, and cities. The Buddha has begun to teach. And with that simple act, The path that was once walked alone begins to be walked by others. At first, the group is small. The 5 ascetics at Sarnath are the first to truly understand his teaching. They become the earliest members of what will later be called the Sangha. But in the beginning, it is not an institution. There are no temples, no elaborate systems, no formal hierarchy. Only people sitting together, listening, reflecting, practicing, trying to understand a way of living that avoids the extremes of pleasure and pain. From this small beginning, something slowly starts to grow. The Buddha does not remain in one place. He travels on foot, through dusty roads, river crossings, and forest paths. The India of this time is a land of many kingdoms, and each region has its own culture, rulers, and traditions. But ideas move freely, and the Buddha's teachings begin to move with them. One of the most important early connections is with the kingdom of Magadha. This is a powerful region ruled by King Bimbisara. Bimbisara is described in ancient sources as a curious and thoughtful ruler. He is interested in spiritual teachers. He listens to wandering philosophers. He respects those who seek truth. When he hears of the Buddha, he becomes intrigued. According to tradition, he meets the Buddha and listens carefully to his teachings. What he hears is not a demand for worship, not a political ideology, not a ritual system, but a practical path focused on understanding suffering and overcoming it. The clarity of this approach leaves an impression on the king. He does not become a follower in a dramatic sense, but he offers support, land, respect, and space for the growing community of monks and seekers. This kind of royal support is significant, not because it creates power, but because it creates stability. Places where monks can gather, where teachings can be preserved, where travelers can rest. As the Sangha grows, it begins to take on a more structured form. Still simple, still mobile, but increasingly organized. Monks travel from village to village. They rely on alms for food. They avoid ownership of property. They spend time in meditation and teaching. And they carry with them a message that remains consistent. Suffering exists, but it can end. Around this time, another important figure enters the story. A wealthy merchant named Anathapindika. He is known for his generosity and compassion. He travels extensively for business, but his interest is not only wealth. He is also concerned with spiritual life. When he hears about the Buddha, he seeks him out. Their meeting becomes one of the most famous early encounters in Buddhist tradition. Anathapindika is deeply moved by the teachings. He becomes a devoted supporter. But more than that, he makes a remarkable contribution. He purchases a large garden in the city of Savatthi, a peaceful place filled with trees and quiet space. He offers it to the Buddha and the Sangha. This place becomes known as Jetavana, one of the earliest major monastic residences. Not a palace, not a temple in the later sense, but a simple environment where monks can stay during the rainy season and continue their practice and teachings. This gift is significant not because of its luxury, but because of its intention. It represents the idea that spiritual practice needs space. Not isolation and wealth, but stability and simplicity. As the Buddha continues to teach, his influence spreads across different regions. Magadha in the southeast, Kosala in the northwest, Small towns, large cities, trade routes, riverbanks, markets where people gather and exchange goods and ideas. The teachings attract a wide variety of followers: kings, merchants, farmers, former ascetics, even some members of noble families. But the Buddha's approach remains consistent. He does not emphasize social status. He does not demand ritual obedience. He focuses on understanding the mind, on observing experience, on recognizing patterns of desire, attachment, and suffering, and on practicing a way of life that leads toward clarity. As more people join, the Sangha slowly develops rules and guidelines, not as rigid laws, but as practical supports for communal living. How to share food, how to travel respectfully, how to resolve disagreements, how to maintain simplicity. The goal is not control. The goal is harmony. And within this growing community, something unusual for the time begins to emerge. A space where people from different backgrounds live and practice together, without caste barriers determining worth, without wealth defining importance, without political power deciding value. Only commitment to understanding suffering and the path beyond it. At the same time, the Buddha continues to move between regions, sometimes staying in forests, sometimes in gardens, sometimes near cities. His life is simple. He owns almost nothing. He depends on the generosity of others, and yet his presence draws attention wherever he goes. People come to listen, some out of curiosity, some out of deep personal struggle, some simply seeking guidance in a confusing world. And slowly, over years, the teaching becomes more widely known. Not through force, not through conquest, but through conversation, through example, through shared reflection. As evening settles again over the ancient landscapes, we can imagine small groups of people gathered under trees, listening quietly, reflecting on ideas that challenge their usual way of seeing the world, noticing suffering, noticing change, noticing the mind itself, and slowly beginning to understand that perhaps freedom is not found in controlling the world outside, but in understanding the mind within. The Buddha continues to walk. The Sangha continues to grow. And the teachings continue to spread gently across ancient India like ripples on still water. But the story is still far from complete. Because as influence grows, new challenges also begin to appear. Questions, misunderstandings, debates, and deeper teachings yet to come. But for now, in this quiet phase of history, everything remains calm. A small community of seekers, a wandering teacher, and a message that continues to travel slowly across the land. A message about suffering, and the possibility of its end. As the night deepens once again, the slow unfolding of this story continues across the ancient landscape of northern India. The Buddha is no longer a solitary seeker beneath a tree. Nor is he only a wandering teacher speaking to small groups of ascetics. By this point, his presence has begun to shape a growing community. A community that travels, listens, reflects, and slowly organizes itself around a shared understanding of suffering and its end. But as with all expanding movements in history, new questions begin to arise. New challenges, new relationships, and new turning points that will shape the future of the teaching. One important aspect of this period is the increasing interaction between the Buddha and influential figures of society. Among them is Javaka, a well-known physician in ancient Magadha. Javaka is respected not only for his medical skill, but also for his proximity to royal circles. He serves King Bimbisara and is often consulted in matters of health and care. His encounter with the Buddha represents an important connection between spiritual practice and practical life. In many accounts, Javaka listens to the teachings and becomes impressed by the simplicity and clarity of the Buddha's approach. Healing the body and understanding the mind begin to appear, in a quiet way, as parallel concerns. One focused on physical suffering, the other on mental and existential suffering, both grounded in observation and careful attention. As the Sangha grows, it also begins to encounter internal differences. One of the most well-known figures associated with early tension is Devdatta. Tradition describes him as a cousin of the Buddha, someone who initially enters the monastic community but later develops ambition and disagreement. Devdatta's story is often presented as a contrast to the Buddha's teaching. Where the Buddha emphasizes balance, Devdatta is associated with stricter and more rigid interpretations of discipline. Over time, this difference becomes a source of conflict within the community. Some accounts describe attempts to introduce harsher rules for monks. Others describe disagreements about leadership and direction. While the historical details are complex and often interpreted differently across traditions, what is clear is that the early Sangha was not entirely free of disagreement. It was a living community. And like all communities, it faced challenges in maintaining harmony. The Buddha's response, as recorded in many traditions, is not one of anger or rejection, but of calm clarification. The emphasis remains on understanding intention, reducing suffering, and avoiding extremes. Not punishment, not dominance, but reflection. During this same period, one of the most significant developments in the early Buddhist community takes place: the inclusion of women into the monastic order. This begins with Mahapajapati Gautama, the Buddha's foster mother. After the passing of Queen Maya, she raised Siddhartha as her own child and played a central role in his upbringing. Later in life, she approaches the Buddha with a request. She wishes to enter the monastic community, to renounce household life, to dedicate herself fully to the path of spiritual practice. At first, according to traditional accounts, there is hesitation. Not necessarily because of rejection, but due to the social and cultural conditions of the time. Monastic life was traditionally male-dominated in many ascetic traditions. But Mahapajapati does not withdraw her request. She and other women persist in their intention. Eventually, the Buddha agrees to the establishment of a parallel monastic order for women. This becomes one of the earliest known instances in religious history of an organized spiritual community for women with formal recognition. The formation of the Bhikkhuni Sangha marks a significant expansion of the teaching. It suggests that the path of understanding suffering is not limited by gender, status, or background. Only by the capacity for practice, reflection, and insight. As the community grows more diverse, the Buddha continues to emphasize certain key teachings. Among the most important is the concept of impermanence. Anicca. Everything that arises will eventually change. Nothing remains fixed. Bodies age. Emotions shift. Relationships evolve. Cities rise and fall. Even ideas transform over time. This observation is not presented as pessimism. Instead, it is a clear description of reality as experienced directly. Understanding impermanence becomes central to reducing attachment. Because if one understands that all things change, then clinging to them as permanent sources of security naturally weakens. Alongside impermanence comes another closely related insight. That clinging itself creates suffering. When the mind grasps tightly at what cannot remain, it experiences loss again and again. In this way, suffering is not only something that happens externally. It is also shaped internally by how experience is interpreted and held. These teachings are not abstract philosophy. They are meant to be observed directly in everyday life. In breathing. In walking. In conversation. In moments of joy and difficulty alike. As the Buddha continues to travel, he teaches in villages, forests, and cities. Sometimes addressing kings and ministers. Sometimes speaking with merchants and householders. Sometimes guiding monks and nuns in deeper practice. The simplicity of the message remains consistent. Observe the mind. Understand experience. Recognize impermanence. Reduce attachment. And gradually, suffering begins to loosen its hold. Still, the growing community is not without complexity. Disagreements arise. Different interpretations emerge. Personal ambitions occasionally appear. But through it all, the central teaching remains steady. A path of understanding rather than force. Awareness rather than control. Insight rather than belief alone. As evening settles once more over the ancient landscape, we can imagine the Buddha seated quietly with his followers. The air is still. The world continues its slow rhythms. And a community gathered around a simple teaching continues to reflect on the nature of existence itself. A teaching that does not promise permanence, but offers understanding within change. And as the night grows deeper, the journey of this tradition continues to unfold across generations yet to come. But for now, in this moment of history, everything remains calm. A teacher, a community, and a path slowly taking shape in the quiet spaces between human questions and human experience. As the night continues to settle gently over this long journey through ancient India, the story now moves into the later years of the Buddha's life. The teachings are no longer a small, emerging idea confined to a few gatherings in forests and gardens. They have become a presence across multiple regions. A quiet but steady influence moving through kingdoms, villages, and cities. And with this wider reach comes a new phase of the Buddha's work. Not discovery. Not experimentation. But repetition. Clarification. And continued guidance for those encountering the path for the first time. By this stage, the Buddha is often traveling between established centers of teaching. Places like Savatthi in the Kosala kingdom become important hubs. Not because they are grand in appearance, but because they provide space where the Sangha can gather during certain seasons, particularly the rainy months. These gatherings are not dramatic events. They are simple assemblies of monks and nuns. Sitting, listening, practicing, reflecting on the same fundamental truths again and again. Suffering exists. It has a cause. It can end. And there is a path leading to its end. As the community grows, so too does the diversity of those who encounter the teaching. One important royal figure during this period is King Pasenadi of Kosala. He is described as a ruler who is both powerful and intellectually curious. He does not approach spiritual teachers merely out of tradition. He engages them with questions, concerns, observations about life, leadership, and human behavior. When he encounters the Buddha, their discussions often center on practical aspects of life: wealth, pride, power, impermanence, the instability of worldly status. Through these conversations, the Buddha's teachings are not presented as abstract philosophy alone. They are applied to the realities of governance and human responsibility. A king learns that authority does not remove suffering. A ruler learns that power does not prevent loss. And even those at the highest level of society are still subject to aging, illness, and death. Alongside royal interactions, the Buddha also continues to guide many individual disciples who become well known within the tradition. Among them is Khema, a queen who later becomes one of the most respected female monastics. Her story reflects a recurring theme in the Buddha's teaching. That deep understanding is not limited by social role or past identity. Khema is described as intelligent and initially attached to beauty and status. But through encountering the Buddha's teachings, she comes to see the nature of impermanence more clearly. Physical beauty changes. Status changes. All external forms are temporary. This realization does not lead to despair. Instead, it leads to a different kind of freedom. A release from the need to maintain or protect what is always changing. She becomes a significant figure in the early Bhikkhuni Sangha, the community of ordained women. Her presence, along with others, helps shape a tradition where insight is valued over identity. During this period, many other disciples also emerge, each with their own background, their own struggles, their own path toward understanding. Some are former nobles, some are merchants, some are ordinary villagers, and some are individuals who once held strong doubts about spiritual life altogether. Yet within the structure of the Sangha, all are given the same opportunity: to observe, to practice, to understand. The Buddha's teaching remains consistent in its simplicity. Do not rely on status. Do not rely on ritual alone. Do not rely on belief without understanding. Instead, look directly at experience, at how thoughts arise and pass, at how emotions shift, at how attachment forms and dissolves. As the years progress, the Buddha continues to travel despite aging. His physical body, like all bodies, changes over time. Fatigue becomes more noticeable. Movement becomes slower. Yet the clarity of teaching remains unchanged. There is a sense in many accounts that his presence becomes more settled, less focused on expansion, more focused on consolidation, ensuring that the teachings are understood correctly, ensuring that the community remains grounded in the core principles. During his journeys, the Buddha continues to revisit familiar places. He speaks to monks who are still learning the discipline of monastic life. He answers questions about meditation, about ethics, about mental training, about how to deal with doubt, distraction, and emotional difficulty. He emphasizes patience, consistency, and direct observation of experience, not as theory, but as practice. As evening approaches in the cities of Kosala and Magadha, we can imagine gatherings of people sitting quietly in shaded halls or beneath trees, listening to teachings that do not promise immediate transformation, but offer a gradual path of understanding. One step at a time, one observation at a time, one moment of awareness at a time. And slowly, across years and generations, these teachings begin to take root. not through force, not through authority, but through repeated reflection and lived experience. The Buddha's later years are not defined by dramatic change, but by continuity. A steady presence in a changing world. A teacher returning again and again to the same essential truths, until they are clearly understood. And as the night grows deeper in our retelling, the story too moves closer to its final chapters, where questions of impermanence will no longer be theoretical, but deeply personal. And the journey of the Buddha himself will approach its final transition. But for now, the teachings continue. Quiet, steady, and deeply human. As the night becomes quieter and deeper, the story now enters its final movement. Not the end of the teaching, but the end of the teacher's physical journey. The Buddha, now in his later years, continues to travel across the familiar landscapes of northern India. But time, as it does for all living beings, begins to leave its mark. The body that once walked long distances without difficulty now moves more slowly. Rest becomes more frequent. Silence becomes longer. Yet the clarity of mind remains steady, unchanged. In these final years, the Buddha is often accompanied by his close attendant, Ananda. Ananda is remembered as deeply devoted, attentive, and emotionally sensitive. He serves not only as a companion, but also as a memory for the community, listening carefully to teachings and ensuring they are preserved and repeated accurately. Their relationship is often described with quiet intimacy, not in a dramatic sense, but in the steady rhythm of companionship on a long journey. As the Buddha travels, he continues to teach. Even as his physical strength declines, he responds to questions with patience and calm clarity. He reminds his followers that aging, illness, and death are not exceptions to life. They are part of it. Not punishments, not failures, but natural expressions of impermanence. In one of the most significant moments of this final period, the Buddha experiences a serious illness. Traditional accounts describe him enduring great physical discomfort. Yet even in this condition, he continues to reflect and teach. This moment becomes a quiet reminder to his followers that even one who has awakened is not exempt from the laws of the physical world. The body follows its own nature, but understanding can remain free. Eventually, the Buddha begins his final journey toward a place called Kushinagar. It is not described as a journey of urgency, but as a gradual movement. A final passage through familiar regions, villages, forests, rivers, places he has visited many times before. Along the way, he continues to teach those who come to see him. Some arrive with questions, some with concern, some simply wishing to be near him. At one point, he stops beneath trees to rest. Even in these moments, teachings continue to arise naturally. Often simple, often focused on mindfulness, on clarity, on letting go. As they approach Kushinagar, the sense of finality becomes more apparent. Yet the tone remains calm. There is no fear, no dramatic resistance, only acceptance. According to tradition, the Buddha lies down between two sal trees. He chooses a resting position, not as defeat, but as completion. Surrounded by disciples, including Ananda, he continues to offer final guidance. He emphasizes that understanding should be the refuge, not personality. That the teaching itself is the guide, not attachment to the teacher. he encourages reflection, awareness, and continued practice. As the final moments approach, the environment is described as peaceful. The trees still, the air quiet, the gathering calm. Then, gradually, the Buddha passes into parinirvana, a term used to describe the final release beyond physical existence. Not a disappearance in the ordinary sense, but the end of the cycle of birth and death for one who has fully understood it. For those present, the moment is deeply emotional. Ananda, in particular, is described as overwhelmed with grief. Others remain silent, reflective, aware that something immense has concluded. Yet even in this moment, the teaching remains consistent. Impermanence applies to all things, even the presence of the teacher. After the Buddha's passing, the community does not dissolve. Instead, it continues, carefully, thoughtfully, with increasing responsibility placed on the Sangha to preserve and transmit the teachings. Monks gather. Memories are shared. Teachings are recited. What had been spoken over decades now begins to take a more formal shape. Not as rigid scripture in the beginning. The understanding that all conditioned things change. That every beginning leads to an ending. And that every ending becomes part of something that continues. The story of the Buddha, as preserved through centuries, does not ask for belief in a single interpretation. Instead, it invites reflection on suffering, on change, on awareness itself. And perhaps, as you listen now, the world around you also feels a little quieter, a little softer, as thoughts slow down, and attention gently rests in the present moment. There is nothing more to achieve in this story, nothing more to pursue. Only the simple continuation of breath, of awareness, of being here. And so, as this long journey comes to rest, we let go of the narrative. We let go of the search. And we remain, for a moment, in quiet understanding. The story ends. But the awareness it points toward continues. And now, you may rest. As we continue beyond what was once called the end of the story, we enter something quieter, more distant, and more reflective. Not the life of the Buddha himself, but the long shadow his teachings left behind. A shadow that slowly becomes history, and then becomes culture, and then becomes memory shared across entire continents. After the passing of Emperor Ashoka, the world of ancient India continued to change. Empires rose and fell. Trade routes expanded. Ideas traveled farther than armies ever could. And among those ideas, the teachings associated with the Buddha continued their slow and steady movement across geography and time. At first, they followed familiar paths. The same rivers, the same caravan roads, the same merchant routes that connected distant cities. Monks traveled alongside traders, sharing food, sharing shelter, sharing simple conversations about the nature of suffering, impermanence, and awareness. From India, the teachings gradually moved outward to Sri Lanka, where early written traditions began to take shape, to Central Asia, where cultures mixed along the Silk Road, and eventually toward China, where translation became a major historical turning point. Each region encountered the teachings differently. Some emphasized meditation. Others focused on ethics. Some developed large monastic institutions. Others preserved smaller, forest-based traditions. but the core ideas remained recognizable. A quiet continuity beneath cultural change. Suffering exists. It has a cause. It can end. And there is a path leading toward that understanding. Centuries later, these teachings would continue moving even further. Into Korea, Japan, Tibet, and Southeast Asia. Each culture shaping the tradition in its own language, art, and philosophy. Temples were built. Statues were carved. Texts were copied by hand. And entire generations dedicated their lives to study and practice. But beneath all these external forms, the original simplicity remained present. A focus on awareness. On observing the mind. On understanding impermanence. And on letting go of attachment. Over time, Buddhist monasteries became more than just places of meditation. They became centers of learning. Preserving mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and literature in different regions of Asia. In some periods, they served as libraries of human knowledge. In others, as quiet refuges during times of political instability. Yet the monastic ideal remained consistent in its essence. A life of simplicity, discipline, and reflection. Not driven by accumulation, but by understanding. Many centuries later, long after ancient kingdoms had disappeared, the influence of these ideas continued in unexpected ways. In the modern world, concepts associated with mindfulness and meditation began to appear in scientific and psychological contexts. Not as religious doctrine alone, but as practical tools for attention and mental clarity. Techniques that focus on breathing, on observing thoughts without attachment, on recognizing emotional patterns. These practices, in simplified form, trace back through long historical lineages. Across cultures. Across languages. Across centuries of human experience. And yet, even in this modern interpretation, the underlying questions remain unchanged. Why do we suffer? Why does the mind cling? Why does change feel difficult to accept? And how can awareness transform the way we experience life? These are not ancient questions alone. They are human questions. Still present. Still relevant. Still quietly observed by anyone willing to look inward. As this final chapter unfolds, we return once more to the tone that has carried this entire journey. Slow. Calm. Unhurried. Because the story of the Buddha, as it has traveled through time, is not only about a historical figure. It is about the persistence of ideas. Ideas that move gently through generations. Like a quiet current beneath changing surfaces. Even now, in different parts of the world, people sit in silence. Some in monasteries. Some in homes. Some in crowded cities. All engaging, in their own way, with attention. With breath. With awareness of change. The external world continues its motion. Technology advances. Cities expand. Societies evolve. But the inner question remains familiar. Can the mind find rest within experience? Can understanding soften suffering? And can awareness bring clarity even in uncertain moments? The tradition does not insist on a single answer. It simply offers a path of observation, of practice, of reflection. The understanding that all conditioned things change. That every beginning leads to an ending. And that every ending becomes part of something that continues. The story of the Buddha, as preserved through centuries, does not ask for belief in a single interpretation. Instead, it invites reflection on suffering, on change, on awareness itself. And perhaps, as you listen now, the world around you also feels a little quieter, a little softer, as thoughts slow down, and attention gently rests in the present moment. There is nothing more to achieve in this story, nothing more to pursue, only the simple continuation of breath, of awareness, of being here. And so, as this long journey comes to rest, we let go of the narrative. We let go of the search. And we remain, for a moment, in quiet understanding. The story ends, but the awareness it points toward continues. And now, you may rest. As we continue beyond what was once called the end of the story, we enter something quieter, more distant, and more reflective. Not the life of the Buddha himself, but the long shadow his teachings left behind. A shadow that slowly becomes history, and then becomes culture, and then becomes memory shared across entire continents. After the passing of Emperor Ashoka, the world of ancient India continued to change. Empires rose and fell. Trade routes expanded. Ideas traveled farther than armies ever could. And among those ideas, the teachings associated with the Buddha continued their slow and steady movement across geography and time. At first, they followed familiar paths. The same rivers, the same caravan roads, the same merchant routes that connected distant cities. Monks traveled alongside traders, sharing food, sharing shelter, sharing simple conversations about the nature of suffering, impermanence, and awareness. From India, the teachings gradually moved outward to Sri Lanka, where early written traditions began to take shape, to Central Asia, where cultures mixed along the Silk Road, and eventually toward China, where translation became a major historical turning point. Each region encountered the teachings differently. Some emphasized meditation. Others focused on ethics. Some developed large monastic institutions. Others preserved smaller, forest-based traditions. But the core ideas remained recognizable. A quiet continuity beneath cultural change. Suffering exists. It has a cause. It can end. And there is a path leading toward that understanding. Centuries later, these teachings would continue moving even further. Into Korea, Japan, Tibet, and Southeast Asia. Each culture shaping the tradition in its own language, art, and philosophy. Temples were built. Statues were carved. Texts were copied by hand. And entire generations dedicated their lives to study and practice. But beneath all these external forms, the original simplicity remained present. A focus on awareness, on observing the mind, on understanding impermanence, and on letting go of attachment. Over time, Buddhist monasteries became more than just places of meditation. They became centers of learning, preserving mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and literature in different regions of Asia. In some periods, they served as libraries of human knowledge. In others, as quiet refuges during times of political instability. Yet the monastic ideal remained consistent in its essence. A life of simplicity, discipline, and reflection. Not driven by accumulation, but by understanding. Many centuries later, Long after ancient kingdoms had disappeared, the influence of these ideas continued in unexpected ways. In the modern world, concepts associated with mindfulness and meditation began to appear in scientific and psychological contexts. Not as religious doctrine alone, but as practical tools for attention and mental clarity. Techniques that focus on breathing, on observing thoughts without attachment, on recognizing emotional patterns. These practices, in simplified form, trace back through long historical lineages, across cultures, across languages, across centuries of human experience. And yet, even in this modern interpretation, the underlying questions remain unchanged. Why do we suffer? Why does the mind cling? Why does change feel difficult to accept? And how can awareness transform the way we experience life? These are not ancient questions alone. They are human questions. Still present. Still relevant. Still quietly observed by anyone willing to look inward. As this final chapter unfolds, we return once more to the tone that has carried this entire journey. Slow. Calm. Unhurried. Because the story of the Buddha, as it has traveled through time, is not only about a historical figure. It is about the persistence of ideas. Ideas that move gently through generations, like a quiet current beneath changing surfaces. Even now, in different parts of the world, people sit in silence. Some in monasteries, some in homes, some in crowded cities, all engaging, in their own way, with attention, with breath, with awareness of change. The external world continues its motion. Technology advances. Cities expand. Societies evolve. But the inner question remains familiar. Can the mind find rest within experience? Can understanding soften suffering? And can awareness bring clarity even in uncertain moments? The tradition does not insist on a single answer. It simply offers a path of observation, of practice, of reflection. And so, as we reach the end of this extended journey, there is no final conclusion to force. No ending to declare as absolute. Only a quiet recognition that stories continue beyond their telling, that ideas continue beyond their origin, and that awareness continues beyond any single moment. The Buddha's life, as remembered, became history. His teachings became tradition, and his influence became part of the long unfolding of human thought. But in the stillness of this moment, what remains is simple. Breathing, listening, noticing, and letting go. And so, as the night settles once more, we allow this final chapter to close gently. Not with certainty, but with calm. Not with conclusion, but with rest. And now, the story fades into silence.